Hey guys, today I'll show you a horror thriller TV series named The Terror Season 1. Spoilers ahead, watch out and take care. The story begins in 1845 as two Royal Navy ships called HMS Terror and HMS Erebus leave Britain, aiming to find a navigable route through the Arctic. These vessels were the most advanced of their time. The last people to see them were whalers, after which the ships vanished without a trace. The scene then shifts to many years later when two Europeans are questioning an Inuit man. They seem to be searching for a group of people. The Inuit man tells them he saw many people walking, starving, and that a captain named Francis was among them. One of the young men points to a photo identifying Francis, to which the Inuit man responds that Francis said they were dying and pointed south, saying they were trying to return home but couldn't move. He mentioned that evil spirits were behind them, which are the shamanic entities that consume anything with legs. The young gentleman dismisses this talk and asks what Captain Francis said last. The Inuit man replies that Francis told him not to let others stay here, that the ship was doomed, the new passage couldn't be found, and that he was already dead. He then produces one of Captain Francis's buttons and places it on the photograph. The scene then flashes back to September 1846, more than a year after the expedition began. HMS Terror and HMS Erebus are sailing deeper into the Arctic. The leader of the expedition, John, is the captain of HMS Erebus, while the aforementioned Francis is the captain of HMS Terror. That evening, John and his officers dine aboard HMS Terror. While discussing the Arctic, a dog on the ship starts barking uncontrollably, though no one pays it much attention. In a private dining room, the senior officers enjoy a fine meal. John informs the group that, based on their current course, they have entered the broken ice zone of the Arctic Circle. He reassures them, saying it's just drift ice brought in by the current, though this statement turns out to be ominous. Suddenly, a young sailor who had been discussing the Arctic starts coughing up blood, and the crew rushes to his aid. Francis meets with John to discuss the recent series of deaths, 3 so far, all without any symptoms. John is determined to reach the Pacific before more lives are lost. A crew member then reports that the young man who coughed up blood appears to have tuberculosis. John suggests bringing the young man to his ship for medical attention. As they prepare to leave, Francis looks at the sun on the horizon, sensing something amiss. In a subsequent conversation, we learn that John's second-in-command, James, harbors some disdain for Francis, as Francis seems indifferent to honor. John and his officers return to Erebus. Just as they are about to welcome John back on board, the ship strikes something. A sailor in the crow's nest falls into the icy water below. A young crew member, nicknamed Rookie, prepares to dive in after him, but the others stop him since the sailor in the water is already dead. At night, the young man who had coughed up blood earlier was transferred to Erebus. After a preliminary examination by the doctor, it was determined that he did not have scurvy. For now, all they could do was keep him under observation. As the night wore on, his condition worsened, and the doctor remained by his side, trying to comfort him. Meanwhile, the sailors on deck could hear the dogs on HMS Terror barking incessantly. Suddenly, the young man below deck saw a strange figure before him. Terrified, he wet himself and shouted for them to run for their shitty lives. However, the bespectacled doctor next to him saw nothing unusual despite wearing glasses. Shortly after, the young man died. The doctor, sensing something strange, rushed to report the situation to another doctor. He was puzzled by the fact that the young man seemed to have seen something invisible to others just before he died. The other doctor dismissed it as a mere deathbed hallucination. In the captain's quarters, a sailor was reporting the day's events to John. The earlier impact was caused by floating ice getting caught in the ship's propeller, and it would need to be cleared for them to continue their journey. John scheduled the repairs for the following day. The next day, John assigned Rookie to dive and inspect the damage. Before setting out, John praised Rookie for his courage, though it was clear that Rookie was extremely nervous. He urged the crew to watch his signals closely and to pull him up immediately if anything went wrong. Rookie donned his diving suit and prepared to descend. Meanwhile, the two doctors began the autopsy on the young man who had died, hoping to determine the true cause of death. The icy waters where Rookie was clearing the ice contrasts with the cold, clinical environment where the doctors were cutting into the corpse. Beneath the surface of the Arctic Ocean, everything seemed claustrophobic and dark. As Rookie finished clearing most of the ice, he suddenly felt something behind him. He turned around and was horrified to see the corpse of the sailor who had drowned earlier. Panicking, he urgently signaled to be pulled up, and fortunately he made it back to the ship safely. The doctors, having completed the autopsy, found no signs of disease or any apparent cause of death. Everything seemed normal. John and his officers questioned Rookie about the situation underwater, and he reported that one of the propeller blades was bent. Thanks to his efforts, the ice that had been lodged in it was now cleared, and the ship should be able to continue its journey. When James asked if there was anything else to report, Rookie simply replied that everything was normal, choosing not to mention the corpse he had seen. John then arranged for Francis and his engineer from his ship to come aboard for a meeting. The senior officers gathered to discuss their next steps. The current situation was that HMS Erebus had sustained damage to its propulsion system due to the ice, and it could only operate at half power. Ahead, the ice was becoming both thicker and more abundant. However, if they could press on for just 200 more nautical miles, they would fill in the last blank space on the Western nautical charts. Everyone agreed with John's proposal, except for Francis, who believed the situation was far worse than they realized. According to him, the fleet was not facing ordinary ice floes, but a massive ice field that would take far longer to cross than anticipated. Moreover, based on his observations, they were about to face the coldest winter the Arctic had to offer. John was perplexed and asked if they were just supposed to wait around. Francis then shared his plan to transfer the fuel from the damaged Erebus to HMS Terror, concentrate their resources, and possibly complete the mission. He warned that if the passage froze over, they would be trapped on the ice, and their fate could very well be death. However, John rejected this sensible plan. He was unwilling to abandon either ship and was confident that they could make it through the ice field. He decided to have HMS Terror lead the way since it had stronger engines but weaker ice-breaking capabilities. Seeing that John was unmoved, Francis dropped the matter but reminded him that they both know what people are capable of in such dire circumstances. Here's a bit of background. John and Francis had previously trekked through the Arctic on foot and had encountered something terrifying during that expedition. Afterward, the crew found a piece of land to bury the young man who had died earlier. John gave a final speech to rally the crew, and they set off, led by HMS Terror, into the mysterious and unknown Arctic seas. But their luck soon ran out. The ship encountered an impenetrably thick ice field. The fleet was trapped by the solid ice, and no matter what they tried, they couldn't break through. By now, they had been stuck for 6 days. Faced with the vast expanse of ice, John had no more options. It seemed they would have to spend the winter there. He ordered the crew to begin preparations for the long, cold season. Meanwhile, James noticed that the ship's compass was behaving strangely, and so the two most advanced ships of their time were now firmly imprisoned on this desolate, icy plain. In the spring of 1847, the crew has now endured an entire winter aboard 8 months after the ships became trapped. John inspects the engine room, where a crew member informs him that the engines have been maintained throughout the winter and are ready to start at his command. John orders them to prepare for the ice to begin melting. To better determine a navigable route, the expedition leaders decide to send out teams of sailors to scout ahead on foot. John gathers the chosen crew members and gives them a motivational speech. The mission is led by a teammate called Graham. John offers him words of encouragement before asking Captain Francis if he has anything to add. Francis simply wishes them a safe journey. After gathering supplies, the expedition team sets out on a new mission. It's important to note that 3 separate teams, each consisting of about 8 men, are dispatched in different directions. The camera follows the team led by the bespectacled doctor. They have been away from the fleet for 3 days, dragging heavy lifeboats across the ice. Graham is leading this team. After some time, they come across an ice wall, which Graham speculates could be the coastline. They decide to leave the lifeboats behind temporarily and continue on foot. After climbing over the natural ice barrier, they finally reach solid ground, but the land is barren and lifeless. Graham uses binoculars to survey a distant pile of stones, and the group heads toward it. Just after climbing the ice wall, Graham mentions that they came to find this cairn, but later, the group seems surprised by it. One of them asks if it was left by the Inuit, to which Graham responds vaguely, saying maybe they were scared off. Graham then signs a letter and places it in the cairn, hoping that the next person to find it will be a British tea merchant returning from Asia. The bespectacled doctor senses something is off, but can't quite pinpoint what. Graham instructs the others to return to camp while he and another crew member investigate another nearby cairn. However, when the doctor and his group return to the camp, they are shocked to find that the previously organized lifeboats and supplies have been overturned by something. Everyone is bewildered. In this desolate place, it couldn't have been done by people, but even a polar bear wouldn't have the strength to cause such destruction. The crew is left utterly perplexed. Back to the fleet, John visits Francis in the captain's quarters of HMS Terror. He's slightly displeased with Francis's parting words to the scouting team, thinking they were spoken in defiance. John tries to make peace, admitting that some of his earlier judgments were flawed. Francis reassures him that he will remain loyal. Their conversation subtly sets the stage for future developments. Turning to the storage room on HMS Terror, a naval officer named Irving hears some noise and goes down to investigate. He discovers two men, one of whom is Hickey, hurriedly pulling up his trousers while claiming they were just looking for something. Irving doesn't buy their story. It's obvious they were engaged in some smelly hormone yoga session. He sternly warns them and leaves. On Erebus, John and James are discussing Francis, and it's clear that neither of them holds him in high regard. Just then, a crew member reports that one of the scouting teams has returned. On deck, they meet a member of the team that had headed east. He tells John that they traveled 11 miles east without finding any signs of the ice melting. The rest of the team is still out there. The team encountered a major problem. The food they brought with them had gone bad, with some of it already rotten and inedible. In this icy wilderness, the lack of food could mean disaster. John tries to reassure the crew member, but the unease in his heart continues to grow, as does his awareness that his crew might not yet grasp the seriousness of their situation. That night, Francis, unable to sleep, has a conversation on deck with his old assistant, Thomas. He asks what they'll do if the ice doesn't melt this year. Thomas replies that if the ice doesn't melt, it will continue to accumulate, eventually lifting their ships. If the ships are raised, they can set sail again, but if the ice crushes them from below, it could break the ships apart. It seems their fate is now in the hands of nature. Francis falls into deep thought, his gaze turning toward the direction where the bespectacled doctor's scouting team had gone, where a thunderstorm is now brewing. Back with the doctor and his team, after packing up their gear, they set up camp to wait for Graham and the others to return. Suddenly, the sky erupts with thunder and lightning, followed by hailstones the size of fists. Just as the storm begins, Graham and his companion return. The team takes shelter in their tents, where they inform Graham about the earlier damage to the lifeboats. Meanwhile, they hear the sound of an animal near the camp. Assuming it's the polar bear, the team grabs their guns. Suddenly, there's movement on the ice wall, and one of the men fires a shot. When they go to investigate, they discover that it wasn't a bear, but an old man who appears to be an Inuit. Then, an Inuit woman is dressed in traditional clothing and speaks in a language they don't understand. At that moment, a bear-like creature appears at the edge of the camp. With one swift move, the creature kills Graham. The bespectacled doctor, witnessing the horror, is petrified. The next day, the crew on Erebus welcomes back Graham's group, including the doctor. But John notices that they are clearly shaken, and Graham is missing. The Inuit elder who was shot by the scouting team is brought into the infirmary. The ship's chief medical officer refuses to treat him, so the bespectacled doctor volunteers to remove the bullet. However, the Inuit woman intervenes, preventing them from helping her father due to the language barrier. At this moment, Francis steps in, revealing that he can speak the Inuit language, and temporarily calms her sexy body down. Unfortunately, the bullet is lodged too deep, and the elder cannot be saved. Before he dies, he speaks some mysterious words to his daughter, who pleads with him not to leave her, saying she is not ready and that the evil spirits will not obey her. However, the elder dies shortly after. To avoid further trouble, John decides to send the woman away, but Francis asks to bring her aboard HMS Terror instead. Afterward, John decides to investigate the attack on Graham's team more thoroughly. He and Francis summon the bespectacled doctor to recount what happened. The doctor describes how they found large footprints at the scene, but no trace of Graham's body. Based on the amount of blood, it seems certain that Graham is dead as a piece of soap. The doctor also mentions that two of their team members have become paranoid, convinced that a bear is stalking them. Before the conversation ends, the doctor reveals one more detail. The tongue of the dead Inuit elder had been cut out. After the meeting, Francis walks alone from Erebus back to HMS Terror. Once aboard, he apologizes to the Inuit woman for the earlier events and introduces himself. He asks where her people are, saying he needs their help. The woman warns him to leave quickly, saying that if they don't, they will soon vanish. Now it's June 1847. Judging by the thickness of the snow around the ship, the ice hasn't melted. In fact, it has thickened. Aboard Erebus, some crew members are preparing the body of the deceased Inuit elder. This elder is the same figure the young man saw just before he died previously. Now it's clear that this Inuit father and daughter had been warning the expedition to leave the area. As they sort through the elder's belongings, the crew finds numerous objects resembling protective charms. The bespectacled doctor, feeling uneasy, insists they put everything back. The crew drags the elder's body onto the ice and drills a hole straight through to the water below. The doctor questions their method, pointing out that it goes against Inuit burial customs, but the crew dismisses his concerns, saying they have John's authorization. They then lower the elder's body into the icy water. On HMS Terror, the elder's personal effects are handed to the Inuit woman, but she asks for his protective charms. Unable to communicate due to the language barrier, they leave it at that. The woman then leaves the ship with some supplies, but instead of going far, she sets up camp not far from the fleet. In the captain's cabin, Francis and his crew discuss the recently deceased Inuit elder. One crew member expresses concern about the Inuit woman. If she returns to her people and tells them what happened, they might seek revenge. The crew member also wonders if the elder's cut-out tongue might be some form of tribal punishment. Before he can finish, another crew member interrupts to announce that breakfast is ready, and Francis heads over to Erebus. In the dining room on Erebus, the crew is eating breakfast, but the usual jovial atmosphere is gone, replaced by a heavy silence. John stares at the empty seat where Graham used to sit, lost in memories of the time before they set sail. At a pre-expedition banquet, a senior naval officer asked John how the preparations were going. John confidently replied that they were fully prepared, with 3 to 5 years of food supplies on board. However, when the officer inquired about the rescue plan, John was taken aback, stating that he had followed every naval protocol and that there was no need for rescue. The officer then warned him that in the Arctic there is nothing, no life, no plants. If things go wrong, they might end up eating their shoes to survive, and even then there might be nothing left to eat. He cautioned that the 130 men John was leading could easily turn against him in their desperation. John knew the dangers of the expedition, but was determined to prove himself, driven by the desire to succeed where he had previously failed. He believed that if he could chart a new path, he would finally earn the respect he craved. Returning to the present, after breakfast, John announces that they will hold a funeral for the deceased Graham the next day, with the entire crews of both ships attending. He reassures everyone that they will capture the bear responsible for Graham's death. Francis arrives at the captain's cabin to meet with John. He proposes selecting 8 of the most capable crew members and sending them south, not to find a navigable route, but to seek help from the nearest British company outpost. He estimates it would take about 3 months, just before winter sets in. John dismisses the idea, arguing that the distance, approximately 2,000 miles, is too great to cover. Francis tries to press the issue, insisting that it's their only viable option. John, however, interprets this as a challenge to his authority and refuses to entertain the idea further. Francis, frustrated, warns that if they don't send for help now, they might all be dead by the time the next winter passes. Still, John remains firm in his decision, insisting that he, as the fleet's commander, makes the final call. He orders Francis to stand down and continues writing what he feels are meaningless eulogies. Francis returns to his ship frustrated and confides in Thomas. He instructs him to select the 8 best crew members for the mission, vowing to take full responsibility. He plans to lead the expedition himself, hoping that if they encounter Inuit people along the way, they might be able to ask for their assistance. Thomas tries to dissuade him, offering to go in his place since he also speaks the Inuit language. However, Francis insists that Thomas's skills are more valuable on the ship, where he can monitor the ice conditions. He also points out that Erebus already has a captain. Thomas worries that John will have Francis executed after the mission, either by his own order or by the Navy's, but Francis is undeterred. He's willing to risk his life if it means his men can survive. He urges Thomas to prepare for the mission to depart as soon as possible. Back to the kitchen, the issue of spoiled food is worsening. The canned food on both ships has started to spoil to varying degrees. The cook advises the crew to use more salt when preparing meals as a way to mask the spoilage. Unfortunately, this issue isn't taken as seriously as it should be. Officer Irving, who discovered their suspicious behavior earlier, confronts Hickey. He warns him to stay away from the man he was playing hormone games with yesterday, saying, "That lad said Hickey forced him." Hickey is taken aback, but before he can respond, Irving gives him a stern lecture, warning that if it happens again, he'll face the lash. After the conversation, Hickey rushes to the man and learns that he lied to Irving to avoid punishment. Hickey, feeling betrayed, is furious, as he thought the man had been his partner for the past few months. The two of them officially end their hormone relationship. Meanwhile, Francis is preparing to leave and is busy writing a letter. The story shifts back to John. He and the bespectacled doctor visit the soldiers tasked with capturing the polar bear. John brings them some alcohol and even takes a photo with these brave men. The doctor, however, is nervous the entire time. After the photo is taken, John and the doctor prepare to leave. A soldier invites John to stay and watch them take down the damned polar bear. But just as the soldiers are brimming with confidence, the creature suddenly attacks. One soldier is killed instantly. John panics and runs back toward Erebus. The crew aboard HMS Terror hears the gunfire, and Francis, using his binoculars, sees the soldiers fleeing in terror. He immediately orders a rescue mission. Meanwhile, James hears John's cries for help and gathers the crew to assist. John is almost at the ship when the mysterious creature grabs him from behind. When he regains consciousness, he finds himself being dragged toward the ice hole where they had previously disposed of the Inuit elder's body. As he is pulled under the ice, memories of the moments before the expedition flood his mind. By the time the crew arrives, they find only John's severed leg and a trail of the creature's footprints. He has vanished beneath the ice. The crew returns, and the bespectacled doctor places John's leg in a coffin. Meanwhile, the other crew members discuss the terrifying event. John's death leaves everyone feeling anxious and fearful. In the captain's cabin, Francis reflects on John's death. Now, with John gone, Francis becomes the highest-ranking officer of the expedition, allowing him to officially implement his rescue plan. However, he decides not to lead the team himself, as his departure could cause chaos. James requests a day to allow all the crew members to mourn John before proceeding with Francis's orders. After the crew holds a funeral for John, Francis delivers a eulogy that was originally written by John for the late Graham. He simply crosses out Graham's name and replaces it with John's. While Francis is conducting the funeral, Hickey, now bitter and spiteful, goes to his former lover's bunk and defecates on his bed. He then sneaks into Francis's cabin and spies on the letters he's been writing. With the funeral over, Francis's rescue team sets out. Meanwhile, the Inuit woman has built an igloo near the fleet. As she works on crafting tools, she hears an animal's growl outside, causing her to freeze in fear. After the noise subsides, she cautiously exits the igloo and discovers a seal carcass laid out in front of her. She looks around uneasily. The mysterious creature seems to have delivered food to the Inuit woman, suggesting it is far more than an ordinary polar bear. Back in Britain, John's wife and his niece are deeply worried about him and his crew. According to the original plan, they should have completed their passage through the Northwest Passage by now. The two women visit a meeting of naval officials. The wife expresses her concern about the expedition, but the officials believe that the team's supplies should last for another 2 years. However, she is already sensing something is wrong and reminds them that John was not the first choice to lead this expedition, not even the third, and this fuels her concern. She doesn't care about glory, she just wants a rescue mission to be sent out. Unfortunately, the officials dismiss her suggestion, stating that if there's no word by 1850, they'll consider sending help. Realizing she won't change their minds, she leaves. The story shifts back to the Arctic fleet. The bespectacled doctor aboard Erebus is examining photographs of the victims. He notices that the wounds on the bodies resemble claw marks from some kind of creature. Meanwhile, Francis sits alone in the captain's cabin on HMS Terror. One of his men reports that the ice has lifted HMS Terror off the water. They're considering moving the crew to Erebus to lighten the load on this ship. Meanwhile, Officer Irving has discovered problems with the food supplies. Some of the canned goods have faulty seals. Just then, screams erupt from the deck. Francis and the others rush to the scene, where a soldier reports that something attacked them from the ship's side, ripping off a soldier's skull cap. Francis orders immediate medical attention for the soldier and tells Thomas that it's on the ship. Suddenly, another crew member reports that someone else has been taken, and he could hear the man's chicken cries for help on the ice. Francis quickly assembles a search party. One of his men expresses concern that the creature might be luring them into a trap, but Francis decides they can't take any chances and leads the search himself. A young crewman insists on joining Francis. The cinematography in this scene is hauntingly beautiful yet eerie, with the northern lights illuminating the sky and the creature's growls echoing in the distance. Following the sounds, Francis finds the body of the sailor who was previously taken. But as he turns around, the young crewman who had accompanied him is also killed by the creature. Francis and the others are forced to retreat to the ship. The Arctic is about to enter the polar night, with no daylight for the next several months, worsening the expedition's already dire situation. Back on the ship, Francis drinks alone, consumed with guilt. He confides in James that he had intended to look after the young crewman today, but the boy was killed right under his nose. Francis tells James that the plan now is to wait for the weather to improve next year, push the ships to safer waters, and hope for rescue. However, James is reluctant to abandon the expedition's mission. At this point, Francis reveals the real reason he joined the expedition. He was entrusted by someone to protect John and prevent him from making unwise decisions. That person was John's niece. In another room on the ship, the bespectacled doctor and his colleagues are tending to the soldier whose skull cap was torn off by the creature. To close the dead man's eyes, the chief medical officer suggests sealing them with wax. Meanwhile, in the dining room, the crew is visibly shaken by the day's events. They are beginning to feel helpless against the creature. When it's time for the shift change, Hickey is assigned to the deck. As he patrols the bow, he notices someone standing by the side of the ship. Approaching to investigate, he discovers that the person has been ripped in half. Hickey locks eyes with the creature in the distance and then turns to ask a fellow soldier if he knows where the Inuit woman's camp is located. The scene shifts. The body found on the deck is brought inside for examination. The doctors discover several unsettling details. The seemingly intact body is actually composed of two different people, and the cuts are incredibly sharp, likely made by something like claws, certainly not by a human or a polar bear. Additionally, the creature that attacked them appears to be highly intelligent. A nearby crew member reports that the creature's footprints suggest it has been circling HMS Terror. Francis asks if any Inuit footprints were found, but the crewman replies that they found none. James then voices his suspicion that the Inuit woman, who has been camped near them for 5 months, might be involved. They still don't know her true intentions. Francis agrees and suggests they bring her aboard for questioning. They plan to send a team to retrieve her in the morning. James speculates that there must be some connection between the creature and the Inuit people. After a day of intense stress, Francis feels overwhelmed and retreats to his quarters to calm himself. There, he recalls a conversation he had with John's niece before the expedition. She had confided that she didn't want to be a captain's wife because of the long absences and the unpredictable dangers of the sea. But Francis reassured her that the Navy was planning a new expedition, one in which he was certain he would be made commander. He promised that after completing the mission, he would retire with honors, and they would live a happy life together. The expedition he referred to is the one they are currently on. Back to the present, as Francis broods, he suddenly hears commotion on the deck. Sensing something is wrong, he grabs the gun hidden under his bed and rushes to the deck with the others. The deck is in chaos, and it takes a shot in the air from Francis to restore order. It turns out that Hickey, along with 2 others, has captured the Inuit woman and brought her back. To prevent the situation from escalating, Francis orders her to be taken for safekeeping. He then questions the 3 men involved in the capture. Hickey explains what he saw when he captured the Inuit woman. He claims she was communicating with the creature, which he describes as being 3 times the size of a polar bear. Throughout the explanation, Hickey is visibly proud, seemingly expecting praise. However, Francis surprises him by announcing that all 3 men will be punished for abandoning their posts, disobeying orders, and disrespecting the woman. They will receive lashes as punishment. Hickey is particularly indignant, feeling that they were solving a problem for everyone and doesn't understand why they should be punished. He argues back, especially on the charge of disrespect, but Francis insists that he was indeed disrespectful to the woman and even increases his sentence. The punishment takes place in front of the crew, and the scene is both philosophical and painful to watch. After the lashes, Francis announces to the crew that HMS Terror is in trouble. The ship has been lifted onto the ice ridge, and the crew members can choose to transfer to Erebus or stay on Terror. Those who choose to stay can exchange a quarter of their rations for alcohol. Meanwhile, Hickey quietly tends to his wounds. When the tally is taken, only 10 men are willing to stay, which leaves Francis drinking alone, burdened with unease. Back to Erebus, the bespectacled doctor and the chief medical officer are treating a sailor when James returns with the Inuit woman. James tells the chief medical officer that someone on the other ship was lashed because of her, and they need to take good care of her. The chief medical officer goes to make the necessary arrangements, leaving the doctor alone to treat the sailor. As the sailor drinks his medicine, the doctor notices that the roots of his teeth have turned black. After finishing the treatment, the doctor brings some food to the Inuit woman, hoping to show kindness and learn more of her language. The two begin to communicate, using words only, but not muscles. The scene shifts to the crew measuring and recording the weather conditions around the fleet. On Erebus, the recently transferred crew from HMS Terror begins to arrive, making the already cramped quarters even more crowded. James asks Officer Edward if Francis will miss the meeting again. Edward replies that he has followed orders and brought the reserve food from HMS Terror, but James senses that something is being kept from him. He also orders Edward to take the Inuit woman back to Terror as per Francis's previous instructions. Edward heads to the cabin where the Inuit woman is being held and finds the bespectacled doctor conversing with her. After learning of James's orders, the doctor expresses his desire to accompany the woman to HMS Terror, mentioning that he is working on an Inuit dictionary. Edward's primary concern, however, is whether the woman has said anything about the creature. The doctor replies that she hasn't yet, but he believes she will soon. The Inuit woman, looking puzzled, then asks about HMS Terror. Turning to the medical bay on Erebus, the chief medical officer is treating a sailor's frostbitten toes, with the only option being amputation. The bespectacled doctor says his goodbyes and leaves. Meanwhile, James is addressing the newly arrived crew members, and it's clear that he's being particularly harsh with them. Shortly after, an aide informs James that someone carrying orders signed by Francis has taken 16 bottles of alcohol. James is surprised, as Francis hadn't mentioned this to him, hinting that the expedition's supplies might be running low. The camera cuts to the team returning to HMS Terror. Along the way, one of the sailors collapses and dies. The rest of the group brings the Inuit woman back on board. Interestingly, Hickey, who had been punished despite his earlier ordeal, also chooses to stay on HMS Terror, hinting that he might be planning something. After settling the woman in, Edward reports to Francis about the journey. He mentions that James ordered them to bring the Inuit woman back and that the doctor has also come aboard. Francis asks to see them both later. He then sends Thomas away and tells Edward that there's no whiskey left on Erebus, only rum and gin. Despite this, Francis orders Edward to take whiskey from James's private stash. It's clear Edward isn't happy about this. Just then, a sailor interrupts their conversation. Before dismissing him, Francis asks how many bottles of whiskey are left in the storeroom. The sailor replies that only 2 bottles remain. Francis turns to Edward and says his time is running out, telling Edward not to leave him without a drink. Back to the bespectacled doctor, he first checks on Hickey, who had been punished, asking about his injuries, and then chats with the medical assistant on HMS Terror. Their conversation turns to a discussion about teeth. The doctor asks if any of the ship's crew have developed gray lines on their gums, along with symptoms like headaches, numbness, and joint pain. He mentions that he initially suspected bismuth poisoning, as he had autopsied several sailors who had died suddenly, and found that some had syphilis and were treated with bismuth, which left deposits on their teeth. Though the color is different, the shape is the same. The medical assistant recalls reading about a case of lead poisoning caused by cider presses made of lead. The doctor realizes that their water tanks are made of lead as well. Though this is just a theory, he decides to investigate further. Meanwhile, Hickey begins scheming again. He approaches Billy, the young sailor he had a previous hormone relationship with, and tries to gain information about the fleet's leadership. He asks Billy to keep an ear out for any gossip, and even gives him a ring as a bribe. Although Billy pretends to resist, it's clear he's pleased with the gift. The crew's morale is deteriorating. This is evident when a Marine who had helped Hickey capture the Inuit woman refuses to help carry a colleague's body, leading to a confrontation with Officer Irving. Hickey steps in to defuse the situation, demonstrating that despite being whipped, he has gained some influence among the crew. After his punishment, someone even placed tobacco in his hammock, and a Marine has been diligently tending to the corpse of the soldier who was scalped earlier. In the captain's cabin, Francis and his team are preparing to meet with the Inuit woman. The bespectacled doctor has been in contact with her for about a month. Francis asks her if she knows what has been killing their men. The woman replies in Inuktitut, calling it an evil spirit. Francis is surprised and questions her further if this is the same spirit that dragged their commander into the ice hole where her father was buried. The woman shakes her head. Francis then asks if the creature acts on its own, to which she responds that it no longer serves anyone. Francis, frustrated, declares that whatever it is, it has already killed several of his men, and he demands to know how to kill it. The woman doesn't give a direct answer. The doctor tries to explain her position, and Thomas notes that she seems as afraid of the creature as they are. Francis, dissatisfied with her answers, threatens to throw her off the ship if she refuses to cooperate. Thomas disagrees with this harsh approach, which only angers Francis more. He warns the woman to help him stop it or leave. The woman calmly replies, even if she could help, he wouldn't accept it, and he just wants to die with the creature. It's clear she has seen through Francis's mindset. As the argument intensifies, James arrives. Francis, irritated, tries to dismiss him, but James is bewildered by Francis's anger and stands his ground. The woman continues, saying Francis knows what he should do, but he doesn't do it. James then accuses Francis of stealing 16 bottles of alcohol from his ship and demands an explanation. Francis, clearly intoxicated, tells James to address him by his proper title and show some respect. James retorts that respect must be earned, further aggravating Francis, who punches him. When Thomas tries to intervene, Francis orders him to go up to the deck and monitor the ice. With no choice, Thomas obeys. As soon as he reaches the deck, a soldier spots the creature approaching and raises his gun. The creature attacks again, interrupting the argument below deck as everyone rushes to help. However, they find the exit blocked by collapsed wooden beams. Realizing the danger, Thomas tells the others to hide while he lures the creature away. He confronts the creature, giving the audience the first clear view of its ugly face. The crew finally manages to escape the cabin to provide support. By now, Thomas has led the creature to the top of the mast, though he's injured, with his leg mauled. He signals to the crew below to fire the cannon. Using a kerosene lamp, he marks the target. The crew fires, hitting the creature, which falls to the ice below, severely wounded. Thomas, having tied himself to the mast, survives the fall. Amid the chaos, the Inuit woman escapes. The crew brings the injured Thomas back to the cabin for treatment. They all commend his bravery, but his leg, damaged by the creature, is beyond saving and requires amputation. Later, the doctor checks the room where the Inuit woman was held and finds several pellet-like objects. After everything is settled, Francis gathers the crew and announces that he's feeling seriously ill and needs to rest for a while. He then hands over command of the ship to Edward. The bespectacled doctor opens one of the canned provisions aboard the ship and notices that the lid has turned black and is covered in metal particles. This moment ties back to earlier, where John had found a small metal piece in his food. The doctor then feeds the tainted food to the captain's monkey. The scene shifts to 2 weeks later at Erebus's meeting room, where James is listening to Irving, who reports that by November, their coal will be exhausted unless they reduce the heating standards now. What's more, only 800 liters of lemon juice remain to combat scurvy, and most of it has already lost its potency. As for the canned food, Irving has personally inspected each one, discarding any damaged cans. He finally understands why the bidding cannery offered the lowest price. This explains why the doctor previously noticed something wrong with the canned goods. Someone had mentioned earlier that the cannery had switched to a new welding method, soldering with tin, which contains about 40% lead. As seen before, there was an issue with this welding. Irving concludes that if they reduce food rations by a quarter, they could last until November of next year, and he hopes their crew numbers don't dwindle any further. James, however, is concerned, saying since the last monster attack was repelled, it hasn't been seen again. If they suddenly reduce rations by a quarter, the crew might raise objections. To avoid unnecessary trouble, he proposes reducing rations by 1/5 and adjusting as needed. Also, he suggests the cook use more salted meat and less canned food in their meals, since they need to start conserving all portable food items. The group is surprised, but James insists they keep today's discussion secret. It seems that he has other plans in mind. Cut to the chief medical officer, his face shows signs of unease. After the meeting, James asks Thomas to stay behind for a private conversation. James inquires about Francis and John's previous expedition. Through their conversation, we learn they spent 3 winters on the previous expedition. Food supplies were nearly exhausted, and some crew members had even contracted scurvy. They had no choice but to start traveling on foot. James says in such desperate conditions, people are prone to certain dark thoughts. Thomas understands what James is implying, but notes that the journey ahead is 3 times longer than before. He continues, saying that it's not just the lack of food, disease, and cold that are terrifying, it's the dark thoughts in people's minds that are the scariest. Thomas predicts what might happen in the future, and this conversation is overheard by another old sailor outside the door. James then asks if he thinks those dark thoughts are present here among them now. Thomas replies without hesitation that they're already here. They can make them disappear, but it will require some sacrifices. He suggests by giving the crew some hope and a future, they might overcome the challenges ahead. After sending Thomas off, James ponders for a moment before heading to a cabin, presumably the captain's private storeroom. He opens a large chest filled with masquerade ball props. James puts on a mask. There's something eerie about this scene. Cut to the HMS Terror. A young sidekick sailor is meticulously caring for the ailing Francis, who is deeply touched by the attention. His attentiveness stems from having cared for his mother in the past. The sidekick sailor also participated in an Antarctic expedition before, which made his mother proud. In the middle of their conversation, the doctor arrives to check on Francis's condition and casually mentions that Francis is recovering well enough to attend the upcoming ball. Meanwhile, Hickey arrives at the location of the soldier whose skull had been partially removed. In a strange twist, the soldier appears to still be alive, with slight movements in his chest indicating breathing. Hickey curiously lifts the cloth covering the soldier's head and pokes his brain with a finger. The scene shifts to the doctor feeding canned food to a monkey. The doctor has been meticulously recording the results of his experiments, and it's becoming apparent that the monkey is starting to exhibit some strange behaviors after consuming the canned food for an extended period. Back to Hickey, who meets up with his gay friend Billy. He learns that the officers have been taking stock of the large containers and have isolated the canned food in separate storage. It seems like he's figured something out as a grin spreads across his face. He tells Billy that they're doing an inventory. Just then, someone from the Erebus arrives to inform everyone that James has planned a celebration for when daylight returns, urging them to prepare. The crew is thrilled by the news. The scene shifts to the Inuit girl who previously escaped on her own. She is struggling to survive on the ice, alone. She constructs an altar-like structure using a seal carcass and begins chanting a ritual. After a while, she senses something approaching. She speaks, offering herself to take her father's place, since they can't be without a shaman for long, and this isn't the way. It becomes clear here the connection between the monster and her tribespeople. The girl then takes out a tool she had sharpened earlier, and in front of the creature cuts off her own juicy tongue. Back to the fleet, the preparations for the celebration are underway. Edward approaches James with concern, noting that while the celebration will lift spirits, their supplies are dwindling too quickly. James responds that even if spring comes next year, they won't be able to take all their supplies with them. It's clear they're seriously considering the possibility of marching out on foot. The scene shifts to Erebus's medical bay, where the young sailor Rookie, who had broken the ice, visits the chief medical officer. He confides that he's been feeling mentally unwell, struggling with loneliness, and hearing a different voice in his head. The medical officer, emphasizing that he's not a psychiatrist, suggests Hickey should maintain a positive mindset, precisely why James is hosting the gathering. Meanwhile, as James is preparing costumes and props, he notices that his head is bleeding. Back on another ship, the monkey suddenly goes mad and dies. The doctor with glasses examines the monkey's body and finds the same symptoms that had appeared in previously deceased crew members: gray lines on the gums. Realizing the canned food is indeed the problem, he rushes to the chief medical officer to share his findings, saying that they had been consuming toxic lead all these years, explaining the mysterious deaths among the crew. The chief medical officer responds he will report this to the higher-ups, but the doctor insists it should be reported right away to avoid further disaster. The chief medical officer, however, asserts that it is his decision when to report, prompting the doctor to understand his place. Meanwhile, James's party tent has been set up, and the crew is in high spirits. Francis and his group arrive, and the atmosphere seems almost otherworldly. After Francis arrives, James tells him to let the men enjoy the night before preparing for the march. Francis gathers everyone for a speech, motivating them to prepare for the journey on foot. While everyone listens to Francis's speech, the chief medical officer, in a fit of madness, releases alcohol and spreads it all around, finally sealing off the exits. Meanwhile, the Inuit girl, having cut off her tongue, arrives at the camp to seek help from the doctor. As Francis is halfway through his speech, she reaches the camp and the doctor prepares to assist her. At the same time, the chief medical officer sets fire to the gathering and, in front of everyone, immolates himself. The fire quickly engulfs the area, trapping the people inside. In the ensuing chaos, many perish in the flames. The survivors split into two groups, one led by James and Francis, who escaped from the left side of the tent, and another group trapped on the right. The man who had left the party early discovers those trapped on the right side and, in an attempt to rescue them, accidentally stabs the medical assistant while trying to cut open the tent. In this tragic fire, both ships' chief medical officers perish, leaving only the bespectacled doctor. As the fire burns until sunrise, Francis and the others assess the damage and count the dead. As the brief daylight fades once more, everyone watches the sun slowly descend. The scene flashes back to 1 month before the expedition's departure. A blonde officer is registering the crew members who have signed up. The name on the list is Hickey, but something is off. It's clear this isn't the same person. Then, the timeline shifts back to the present, April 22nd, 1842. The crew is packing up, preparing to set off on foot. James complains to Francis that the crew is bringing along many unnecessary items, which will slow down their progress. Francis reassures him, saying it's fine, they'll have to discard some of it along the way. Now the team has been split into two groups, the first with 50 people and the second with nearly 40. It's clear that Hickey and Billy have formed a large faction, which includes not only regular sailors but also naval soldiers. Billy expresses concern about the creature, and another young man mentions that the crew's health is deteriorating, likely due to lead poisoning, though they don't yet realize this. Billy, trying to rally the group, says they're all in this together, as they discuss plans to break away from the main group. Hickey suggests recruiting more people, regardless of rank. The more, the better. It seems they're on the verge of mutiny. Meanwhile, in the captain's quarters, Francis and the others are unaware of these developments as they discuss the next steps. With the ice possibly melting at any time, they decide to leave some people behind. If the ice does melt, those left behind will wait at the mouth of the river, while the main group signals them from the shore. If no signal is received by September, it will mean they've reached the mainland, and the remaining crew should turn back at full speed. Francis knows he's taking a gamble. Those left on the ship might survive if the ice melts, but if it doesn't, they face certain death. With that, Francis leaves HMS Terror and the group prepares to march. Captain Irving then gives the order to move forward. Later, an iceberg blocks the group's path, forcing them to move one boat at a time. Francis and his team continue along the path taken by the previous group. As night falls, the crew sets up camp. The doctor approaches Rookie asking how he's been. Rookie admits that he didn't want to attend the feast but went anyway to avoid feeling lonely. However, the events that transpired have left him haunted, with the smell of burning flesh from the charred bodies lingering in his mind. It's clear his mental state is deteriorating. The doctor tries to comfort him, then seeks out Francis, suggesting they form a hunting party since the canned food is no longer safe for the crew. Francis, however, says it's not the right time yet. Many people lack hunting skills. He assures the doctor that they will organize a hunting party once they reach the mainland. The next morning, the crew lines up to receive their food rations. Some sailors complain to Hickey that the rations are getting smaller. Hickey notices the Inuit girl in line and watches as the doctor pulls her aside, preventing her from eating any canned food. Meanwhile, two sailors on watch make a horrifying discovery. Francis and James arrive at the scene to find that the rescue party Francis had sent out earlier has been slaughtered. Their heads have been severed and placed together. Francis orders everyone to keep this a secret for now. After some time, the expedition finally reaches land. Francis and James spot the camp left by the previous group, and the discovery brings a glimmer of hope to the despairing crew. However, the naval sergeant who discovered the rescue party's fate approaches Francis, requesting that weapons be distributed to some of the crew for protection. When he names those he wants to arm, Francis refuses. After the sergeant leaves, Edward asks why Francis denied such a reasonable request. Francis explains that while the request was sensible, the list of names was not, as it included Hickey and those close to him. That evening, the doctor is nervously packing his belongings when he takes out the long-dead monkey, creating a disturbingly eerie scene. Suddenly, there's a commotion outside the camp. A sailor who had discovered the severed heads is in agony, begging others to kill him and end his shitty life. The doctor had previously identified signs of lead poisoning in this man's gums. Despite Francis and the others trying to calm him down, the sailor grabs a gun. After a moment of hesitation, he shoots, hitting James's lantern. A nearby soldier then shoots the sailor, killing him. With everything settled, Francis arranges for the sailor to be buried the next morning. The doctor, deeply shaken, retreats to his tent, where the Inuit girl finds him and embraces him without giving him a hormone therapy, helping him regain his composure. The next morning, Francis is in his tent shaving. He summons one of the sailors who had previously helped Hickey capture the Inuit girl and questions him about the incident. He asks if there were more than just the three of them involved. The sailor advises Francis to be wary of someone named Armitage, who turns out to be the blonde officer as shown earlier. Later, Francis holds a high-level meeting to address the situation they're facing. He reveals that the canned food supplies are not only spoiling, but are also contaminated with lead, which has been poisoning the crew. To address this, he proposes organizing hunting parties, one to the south and one to the east, each led by 2 officers and accompanied by 4 sailors of various ranks. Edward volunteers to lead the southern group, while Irving offers to take the eastern group. However, Francis insists that Edward must stay behind to work with James on finding a freshwater source. Edward, puzzled, points out that they only have 3 captains left. Francis explains that this meeting has another purpose, to promote someone to the rank of captain. He chooses the sidekick sailor who has been taking care of him for the role. It seems loyalty pays off, as everyone congratulates the sidekick sailor on his promotion. Meanwhile, in another tent, Hickey is stirring up trouble. He gathers Armitage and the naval sergeant who found the severed heads and shares that their canned food is contaminated, but the captains have been lying to them. That's why they're organizing these hunting parties now. Armitage asks what they should do now. Hickey suggests they head south, arguing that if they manage to catch a seal, they won't have to eat the canned food anymore. The sergeant hands Armitage a bag of dog meat, saying it was from the captain's dog. Hickey adds that there's enough meat here for a feast, but if they turn it in, they'll only get a small share. Armitage is outraged, noting that the dog was supposed to be used as a sentry. Hickey justifies his actions, saying the dog had injured its leg, so he had to put it down. He then tries to persuade Armitage to break away from the main group, promising to make him a captain, which Hickey claims is their only hope for survival. The scene shifts to Irving leading Armitage, Hickey, and the others on a hunt for game. After a day of trudging through the barren wilderness, Irving decides to split into 2 teams. He, Hickey, and another sailor form one group, while Armitage leads the others. After some time, Irving's group encounters a band of Inuit. Irving communicates with them and even receives some food as a gesture of goodwill. To express his gratitude, Irving gives them his telescope. However, when he turns around, he realizes that the 2 men who had been standing with him have disappeared. He frantically searches for them and spots Hickey and the others in the distance. As he rushes over, Hickey, seemingly possessed, kills Irving. The scene then flashes back to 1 month earlier. Sailors are reporting for duty, and the blonde officer Armitage is in charge of verifying their identities. Hickey, who is actually impersonating someone else, presents his information. Armitage is suspicious of him, but ultimately allows him to board the ship. This reveals that Hickey had infiltrated the expedition by assuming another man's identity. With Irving dead, Hickey's true nature begins to emerge. When he saw that Irving had found hope, he panicked and resorted to murder. Turning to Francis and James, they arrive at the cairn where Graham and his party had previously left messages in episode 2. James records the details of Graham's exploits before they head back to camp. On the way, James opens up to Francis about his past, revealing that his father was deeply in debt and worked at the Brazilian consulate, mingling with Portuguese nobility. James confesses that he's an illegitimate child, not even a true Englishman, and that he went to sea at the age of 12. He admits that he has spent his life chasing honor and status, but now sees it as meaningless. All he wants now is to be genuine friends and brothers with Francis. Francis points out the fact that he can recognize this means he is already free. As they approach the camp, they notice something is amiss. Everyone is on edge. Francis and James rush to the tent where Edward briefs them on what happened. Irving and his group were attacked, and the weapon used was a knife. Armitage reports that Hickey spotted some Inuit in the distance, who then attacked and killed Irving and the others. Hickey came back to notify them, and they went out and killed the Inuit, although one escaped. Francis questions Armitage, asking if he saw any weapons on the Inuit or blood on them. Armitage, taken aback, says he was shocked when he saw the wounds on Captain Irving and the others. Only savages could do something like that. Francis is skeptical and insists on inspecting the bodies. Francis then asks Thomas to bring the Inuit girl to the scene as well. When they arrive at the place where the bodies are being kept, they find that Irving's scalp has been removed and his body is covered in knife wounds. Francis is visibly shaken. The Inuit girl arrives, and Francis asks her if her people would do something like this, but the girl shakes her head. Meanwhile, in another tent, Hickey was making a big deal out of the situation. He first described the tragic scene of Captain Irving's death, claiming that the Inuit were extremely savage, and if they don't turn back now, they'll all be killed by them. Midway through his speech, a sailor came over and informed him that Captain Francis wanted to speak with him. Afterwards, Francis arranged for the doctor and others to visit the scene together. Before leaving, he instructed Edward to strengthen the camp's defenses, but not to distribute firearms to the crew. As Francis and the others were preparing to depart, Hickey and the sergeant approached. Hickey reminded the sergeant that it was time to distribute the guns. The scene then shifts to the medical station, where Rookie was helping an old sailor bandage a wound. A soldier came looking for the doctor, but the old sailor told him that the doctor was out. The soldier described his symptoms: headaches, blackened teeth, and dark spots on his body. The old sailor reassured him, saying it was nothing serious. After leaving, Rookie disappeared. The narrative returns to Francis and his group. They arrived at the crime scene, where Francis discovered that all the Inuit present had been killed, including several children. Francis inspected the seal meat among their belongings. The Inuit woman was extremely distressed, and under the doctor's questioning, they learned that these people were her friends. A thick fog enveloped the camp. Crew members approached the sergeant guarding the weapons, saying they heard noises in the fog and hoped he would arm everyone. The sergeant took this opportunity to distribute guns. Meanwhile, James was in his tent, removing his clothes to reveal ulcers on his body. Edward, while patrolling the camp, noticed that the crew were all armed and rushed to the armory. It turned out that the sergeant had opened the armory under the pretext of defending against the Inuit and was distributing weapons to the crew. Seeing that he couldn't control the situation, Edward instructed someone to record the distribution of weapons. At the same time, Francis and his group were returning to the camp. As they approached, someone fired a warning shot. Upon realizing it was Francis, James came to meet them. Francis asked in anger what's going on here. James explained that the armory has been opened. By the time he found out, 20 guns had already been distributed. They can't control the situation inside now. It's best to keep the Inuit woman away from the camp to avoid conflict. The doctor noticed that Hickey had already rushed into the camp. He would inform everyone that they had returned. Francis told the Inuit woman to leave quickly and find her people. The doctor reluctantly said goodbye to her. Back at the camp, Hickey was extremely excited. Billy and the others were arranging their next plan. First, ensure their people were all armed, then select a lifeboat and bring enough supplies and equipment. That night, Billy would go to the captain's quarters to find the navigation charts and burn all the others. In the tent, Francis and James found Edward. Francis asked Edward why he had allowed the armory to be opened. Edward felt helpless. He couldn't control the situation at the time. Francis said that if it turned out Hickey had killed Captain Irving, then this murder was not a spur-of-the-moment act, but premeditated. If that's the case, they don't know how many people they've gathered and what they're planning. Edward asked if there was any evidence for these accusations. Francis then opened the seal meat he had brought back. Afterwards, Francis found the doctor and asked him to perform an autopsy on Captain Irving. The doctor opened Irving's stomach and found seal meat inside, which meant that the group of Inuit had given Irving food. Everyone present was shocked. Francis remarked that this contradicted Hickey's account, and he's obviously lying to everyone. This lie has caused 7 deaths. After uncovering the truth, Francis arranged for Hickey to be arrested. At this point, Edward also revealed the truth about the opening of the armory. It was actually the sergeant who distributed the guns. Edward had believed him and gave the order to open the armory. Francis and the others realized the seriousness of the situation. Francis assigned his trusted men to disarm the other crew members and replace the guards at the armory. Simultaneously, they arrested the sergeant and Hickey and set up a military tribunal to punish them. With Francis's timely intervention, Hickey and the others were apprehended. Then, in front of the crew, the crimes of Hickey and the sergeant were announced: the malicious murder of Captain Irving and a soldier, inciting and planning a mutiny. They were sentenced to be hanged. Francis stepped forward and listed Hickey's crimes, saying Captain Irving had found the Inuit and they could have gotten their help. But unexpectedly, Hickey killed Irving and stabbed 23 holes in his lungs with a ship's knife. These Inuit are not bandits or robbers. They were just an ordinary family. Francis declared that Hickey deceived all of them because his purpose was to undermine his leadership among them to carry out his plan. Through this incident, Francis managed to reunite everyone. Just as Hickey and the others were about to be executed, a man's laughter echoed through the thick fog. Everyone realized it was Rookie, but immediately following was the monster's roar. The evil spirit had returned. Panic ensued, and Hickey seized the opportunity to escape. The monster rampaged through the camp, hunting people at will. Crew members were killed one after another. Hickey and his group took the chance to steal a large amount of supplies and equipment, and they also kidnapped the doctor. Meanwhile, James in the camp brought out a rocket launcher and struck the monster. The monster turned and saw the now insane Rookie, pounced on him, and while killing Rookie, absorbed his soul. Witnessing this scene, the sergeant was terrified and fled for his shitty life. The scene shifts to a charity event in London, when the wife of the late Captain John is delivering a speech. She appeals to the audience to donate funds to organize a rescue team. Her goal is to trace the path of the expedition and search for over 100 missing crew members. Back to the Arctic, the men are cleaning up the camp, tending to the dead. James approaches Francis to report that they no longer have the strength to bury all the fallen crew members. They have found 32 bodies and 23 are still missing. Francis inquires about the doctor's whereabouts. A sailor suggests that he was likely taken hostage by Hickey and his followers. Francis's team is caring for a young sailor. Although his injuries aren't severe, he seems to have lost consciousness. It appears that the monster may have stolen his soul. Without a professional doctor, no one knows what's wrong with him. James is puzzled, wondering why crew members with different injuries are exhibiting the same symptoms. The old sailor shares his thoughts, saying that a crew member previously attacked by the monster had all the writing vanish from his journal, an eerie occurrence. After tending to the dead, Francis addresses his men, promising to bring them all back home safe and sound. He believes what they need to do now is keep moving forward, so he orders his men to burn the bodies of the deceased. James expresses concern about Hickey's group, fearing they might return to loot the camp. However, Francis believes they are simply frightened men who have lost their way. James remarks poignantly that a captain loves his crew more than God does. With the bodies burned, the crew sets off once more. The scene shifts to Officer Armitage. During the monster's previous assault on the camp, Armitage became separated from the others. Starving, he contemplates eating his own shoes. Just then, he spots a group approaching. It's Hickey and his men. Hickey warmly greets Armitage, telling him they've set out ahead, and though they haven't found any game, they do have food. They continue their journey and after some time stop to rest. Hickey and Armitage discuss the canned food. From their conversation, it's clear that Hickey's mindset is beginning to change. He asks Armitage what they should eat next. Meanwhile, Billy goes to the doctor seeking medical attention. The doctor informs him there's no cure and death is inevitable. After finishing his conversation outside, Hickey approaches them to inquire about the situation. Learning that Billy can no longer be of use to him, Hickey flashes a sinister smile. He returns to his tent and retrieves the same knife he used to kill Irving. Billy is subsequently killed. Back with Francis's group, they are struggling to pull the heavy Tesla lifeboats across the desolate landscape. Unfortunately, James, already ill, collapses from exhaustion. Francis orders that James be placed on one of the boats to rest, along with other ailing crew members. He encourages James to stay strong before the group presses on. Edward approaches Francis with a report. He has seen the monster heading toward the glacier and notes that it appears to be wounded. Just then, James experiences excruciating pain as his wounds are aggravated by the jostling. Francis orders the men to set up camp immediately. Once settled, Francis holds a meeting. The sailor informs him they had run out of salted beef since noon. All they have left are biscuits, chocolate, and those dreadful canned goods. Edward shares his concerns that dragging a boat full of wounded men is severely slowing them down. Perhaps they could let them rest here while the majority of them continue south. Once they find food, they'll return for them. The sailor counters, saying that would be a death sentence for them. It's clear they're considering the harsh reality of possibly abandoning some to save others. Francis firmly rejects the idea, declaring that he will not abandon any one of them. That evening, Francis visits James. Racked with pain, James knows he doesn't have much time left. He asks Francis not to let his body go to waste after he dies. James pleads with Francis to end his suffering. With great sorrow, Francis grants his wish and ends James's life. The next morning, everyone gathered to bury James. Francis did not see him as food. The camera lingers on James's burial, focusing on his shoes, which have John's name on them. At this moment, a young man approaches Francis, saying he spotted the creature about 2 miles away and it appears to be tracking them. Francis instructs the group to assemble the crew to discuss their next steps, leaving behind Thomas for a private conversation. Francis decides to heed Edward's earlier advice, to leave the injured crew members to rest where they are. Thomas then suggests that the group continue inland while he lures the creature toward the glacier. Francis, unwilling to lose another friend, disagrees with this plan. However, Thomas reveals his severely infected leg, showing that he doesn't have much time left. Death is inevitable for him. The sense of despair is palpable as Francis watches his friends and comrades drop one by one, powerless to stop it. Thomas tells Francis he needs nothing except a handful of harpoons and a coil of rope. Francis seems to understand his intention. Thomas then bids farewell to the group and heads off alone in a different direction. After walking some distance, another person collapses, and the others are forced to carry him back to the ship. Meanwhile, Hickey and his group have been following Francis's team. The sergeant tells Hickey that he has a good relationship with someone in Francis's crew. He informs them that Francis's group has set up camp not far ahead, a location that will become crucial to the plot later on. Hickey suggests they set up camp as well. At lunchtime, Hickey approaches the doctor, asking him to perform an autopsy on Billy, whom Hickey had killed earlier. The doctor refuses, but Hickey then reveals his true motive for keeping the doctor captive, because he's an expert in autopsies. It becomes clear that Hickey has had cannibalistic intentions for some time, planning to distribute Billy's flesh among the group to help more people survive. Seeing the doctor's reluctance, Hickey threatens him, stating that if he doesn't comply, Armitage will die, and the doctor won't be able to escape responsibility either. With that, Hickey leaves. Left alone in the tent, the doctor hears the group outside preparing to harm Armitage. Left with no choice, he finally agrees to the autopsy, asking for 40 minutes. Time passes quickly, and the doctor emerges from the tent, dragging 2 bags of something and handing them to the cook. Soon, the group starts eating human flesh. This scene is haunting, as Armitage later tells the doctor that if he had been brave enough, he would have killed Hickey, but he was simply too hungry and wanted to survive. The following morning, the sergeant reports to Hickey that he spotted the creature, now positioned between their group and Francis's. Hickey proposes luring the creature toward Francis, but the sergeant suggests they could return to the HMS Terror, as the ice around them is beginning to melt. They've only covered a quarter of the distance, and if they go back now, they might still survive. They could then escape that malevolent spirit. Hickey senses the sergeant's fear. The sergeant recounts the terrifying moment when he saw Rookie's soul being devoured, a fear unlike anything he's ever experienced. He says that if the creature continues following Francis's group, they could escape. Hickey agrees with the sergeant's plan and instructs him to send a message to his friend in Francis's crew. Sure enough, a young man in Francis's group soon reports that he has seen the ice melting through his telescope. Overjoyed, Francis prepares to take his team to the site to investigate, unaware that it is all a trap set by Hickey's group. Their real aim is to capture Francis. To force his submission, they shoot and kill one of Francis's crew members. To avoid further unnecessary bloodshed, Francis agrees to go with them. But before leaving, he tells Edward to lead the rest of the group south. The story then shifts to the Inuit girl, who has found her tribe. The tribe elder tells her that the island has nothing left to offer them. All the creatures with legs have fled, and if not for the sea providing some food, they would be starving. He says they need a shaman because a shaman can find Tunbak, the Inuit name for the creature, an evil spirit banished to the Arctic by the Inuit gods. This creature is the soul-devouring bear monster, and only by controlling it can the natural balance be restored. The elder explains that Tunbak is tied to her life. The girl's father was a shaman who accidentally got killed by the ship's crew, thus unleashing the creature's wrath. To regain control over the creature, the girl cuts out her tongue and seals a pact with it. This is why the creature had stopped killing for a while, but Hickey's machinations and the killing of the Inuit squad caused the creature to resurface and start its killing spree again. Now, the girl must regain control. Elsewhere, Thomas has finally reached the shoreline. Through his telescope, he is astonished to see that the ice has indeed melted. Excited, he marks the Northwest Passage on his map. But just then, he hears the creature approaching. Now covered in harpoons, Thomas laughs as the creature's ominous growl grows nearer. The scene shifts to Francis being escorted back to the camp by Hickey's men. Hickey himself is already waiting there. A detail here ties back to the previous plot. Francis notices that Hickey is wearing the shoes that belonged to James, who died earlier. This realization hits Francis hard. He understands now that Hickey's group had been stalking them all along and even went as far as to dig up the corpses, surely for meat. Meanwhile, Edward gathered the remaining crew members for a meeting. He wants to organize a rescue team to save Francis and those forced to stay behind, and to execute those who participated in the mutiny. However, the crew members are now solely focused on carrying out Francis's last order, to continue moving south. In fact, just an hour earlier, they had taken a vote and reached a consensus, not only to keep moving south, but also to depart that very day, leaving the sick behind to rest. But everyone knew that leaving them was essentially a death sentence. The promise to return was merely an empty comfort. Back to Hickey's camp, the doctor is tending to the wounds on Francis's head. Francis asks which of the group members are armed, and the doctor names them one by one. The doctor also tells Francis that Billy was killed and that his body was used as food. Francis is horrified and tells the doctor that if they ever get the chance, they should escape together, as the main group needs a doctor. However, the doctor, burdened by guilt over his role in the cannibalism, confesses that he doesn't think he'll ever make it out of the camp. Their conversation is interrupted when one of Hickey's men arrives, saying that Hickey wants to see Francis. As Francis prepares to go, the doctor quietly warns him that if they decide to eat him and Hickey forces Francis to eat his meat, he should only eat the flesh from the top of his foot, the hardest part, and that's the key to everything. The focus then returns to Edward's group. The sick crew members have been left behind, including the young sailor who had just been promoted to captain. Watching the group leave, he feels a deep sense of despair. The scene cuts back to Hickey's camp, where Francis enters Hickey's tent. Francis tells Hickey that he would forgive everyone except him and asks why he was captured. Hickey reveals his goal to catch Tunbach. He doesn't believe that they can injure the creature disguised as an animal with cannons. It seems Hickey has some plans for the creature. After this conversation, Francis is imprisoned again, this time in a tent with the ship's former cook. Francis plans to escape with the cook, who agrees to help him. Meanwhile, the doctor is seen preparing a poison. He applies it all over his body, except for his stinky feet, and then drinks a bottle of it. After putting his clothes back on, he lies down on the bed and uses a tool he had prepared earlier to slit his wrists. The next morning, everyone was abruptly woken up by Hickey's men. Francis immediately sensed that something was wrong. As he stepped out of the tent, he was met with a sight he could hardly believe. Everyone was feasting on the doctor. Hickey informed Francis that the doctor had taken his own life, offering himself to the group, and invited Francis to join in the meal. When Francis hesitated, Hickey threatened the life of a young man in the group, forcing Francis to take a knife, cut off the doctor's heel, and eat it. After seeing Francis eat, Hickey allowed the rest of the group to partake in the doctor's flesh. Francis subtly signaled to the cook and Armitage not to eat. Halfway through the meal, Hickey announced that it was time to get to work. He then approached the sergeant and knocked him out with the butt of a rifle. The group was now forced to haul a lifeboat up to a ridge. All those who had previously supported Francis were now chained together. Hickey planned to summon the creature there. The group assumed that Hickey wanted to kill the creature and harvest its meat and fur, which they believed would give them the resources to survive and return to England. But Hickey revealed a different plan, saying that they were not going anywhere. Just then, the crew members who had eaten the doctor's flesh began showing signs of poisoning. Francis realized the doctor's true intention. At this moment, Hickey finally revealed the truth. Long ago, a young man named Hickey had told him about an Arctic expedition. As previously hinted, this Hickey had been an imposter. He recounted how, after learning that spending a year in the Arctic would allow him to sail to the Hawaiian Islands, a paradise on Earth, he decided that a year wasn't too much to bear. So he killed the real Hickey, dumped his body in a river, and assumed his identity. Francis questioned why Hickey didn't just join the expedition through normal channels. Hickey replied that he had planned to desert the fleet upon reaching Hawaii, as he had seen photos of its breathtaking landscapes. But unexpectedly, he would still be stuck in this frozen wasteland 3 years later, doomed to freeze to death. As Hickey's mental state deteriorated, he began singing wildly, attempting to attract the creature. And indeed, the creature charged toward the group. With Francis and the others chained up and unable to escape, the crew members were slaughtered one by the creature. Hickey, however, was thrilled by the carnage. He picked up a knife, intending to cut out his own tongue, just as the Inuit girl had done, in a bid to make a pact with the creature rather than to terminate it. As the creature prepared to attack Francis, Hickey, holding his severed tongue, tried to display it to the creature. But to everyone's horror, the creature tore his smelly parts in half instead. Mortally wounded, the creature was on the brink of death. Just before dying, it struck Francis one last time. The next morning, the Inuit girl found the group's camp. She discovered the dead creature and poured water into its mouth from her flask. After inspecting the scene, she found that Francis was still alive, though his hands were bound with chains. With no other option, she cut off Francis's hand to free him. On their way back, they passed through Hickey's camp, where the doctor's dismembered body was laid out. After some time to recuperate, Francis's health improved. He told the Inuit girl that he planned to find Edward, who had left earlier. The next part of the episode is mostly silent, conveyed through music and visuals that capture a sense of despair and desolation. Finally, Francis found Edward and the others who had left earlier. Next to their fire were uneaten human legs, and the crew members, huddled together, were all dead. In one of the tents, Francis found a barely alive Edward, who had pierced his face with chains to keep himself awake. Seeing his captain at last, Edward used his last bit of strength to utter the word "close" before dying on Francis's shoulder. Thus, the Northwest Passage expedition led by John ended in tragedy, with Francis being the sole survivor. Afterward, Francis accompanied the Inuit girl back to her tribe. There he met the tribe's elder, who for the first time revealed the girl's name, Silna. Francis told the elder that all his people were dead. The elder then inquired about the death of the creature Tunbach, but Francis only exchanged a silent look with the girl. Later that night, Silna left the tribe alone. The next morning, Francis discovered that Silna had left. He asked the elder what had happened, and the elder explained that with Tunbach gone, Silna had to leave. She could no longer stay with them. Francis asked why, but the elder simply replied that there was no reason. Everyone must accept it. The scene shifts to England, where a naval officer bids farewell to his friend, announcing that he is setting off to rescue John's fleet. He assures that the two ships, HMS Enterprise and Investigator, are top-notch vessels, and the mission is in good hands. A separate rescue team is also departing from the Pacific, and they will search from the east, west, and south simultaneously. The story then jumps to September 1850, 2 years later. An Inuit man rushes to inform the elder that two strangers have arrived. Francis realizes that the rescue team has come, leading to the scene that opened the season. The elder recounts the story of Francis to one of the newcomers, the naval officer from the rescue team. The elder's tale is what Francis had instructed him to say, and outside the tent, Francis listens quietly. In the end, Francis fully integrates into Inuit life. This is Daniel CC Movie Channel. Stay safe and enjoy your day.